For approximately 30 seconds after beheading, a severed head may retain consciousness, during which time the eyes might blink, lips may try to speak, and awareness lingers as life wanes. This gruesome half-minute was likely experienced by Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, and one of history's most infamous queen beheadings. While contemporary accounts often gloss over these details, a closer look at her final moments reveals a psychological torment far more chilling than a mere execution swing. Anne's execution serves as a grim reminder of Tudor England's brutal justice system, where death was not the end, but rather the conclusion of a skillfully orchestrated humiliation. Although many history books merely state she was beheaded for treason, her last days were characterized by a psychological deconstruction so meticulous it would impress even modern torturers. Anne Boleyn's execution was not merely an ending, it served as the culmination of Henry VIII's crusade to eliminate a woman who had grown too influential for his convenience. By May 19, 1536, and had already spent 17 days confined in the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had earlier prepared for her coronation a mere 3 years prior. She was crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. However, as she now faced death in an unsettling limbo as Henry VIII callously prolonged her mental torment by delaying her execution. The king had even summoned a skilled swordsman from Calais to carry out the execution instead of using the traditional English axe, a detail often depicted as mercy, but which only underscored the dramatic nature of the impending event. Despite the grim circumstances, Anne reportedly demonstrated an extraordinary composure in her last moments, described by onlookers as cheerful while preparing for death. Friends, please help us get our first 1,000 subscribers. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel below this video. It is free and will motivate us to keep making videos. One psychologist could identify this as dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism activated by severe trauma. She allegedly made light of her situation with gallows humor, implying she was insentient or one without a head, indicating an underlying emotional turmoil. Historical records often overlook the intense fear she must have experienced, knowing that her reputation was being deliberately tarnished through false accusations of adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king. What makes Anne Boleyn's execution particularly unsettling is not just the physical beheading, but the deliberate destruction of her identity. Henry VIII did not merely seek Anne's death, he aimed to erase her from history, invalidate her accomplishments, and undermine the legitimacy of her daughter Elizabeth. The execution was the climax of a defamation campaign intended to convince the English people that their former beloved queen deserved such an end. Prior to her demise, Anne endured scandalous fictitious stories implicating her in sexual immorality, claims so outlandish they would be discarded by contemporary courts. The morning of May 19 presented an uncharacteristically bright day in London, in stark contrast to the grim events that were about to unfold. Anne spent her last night praying, yet sleep continually eluded her. Records from the tower indicate she requested the sacrament at 2 in the morning, kneeling before it for hours in desperate communion. By dawn she had already been awake for nearly 24 hours, her mind likely fractured by stress and fatigue. Upon being summoned by the lieutenant of the tower, she was said to be laughing with her companions, a reaction suggesting not serenity, but psychological deterioration. Anne's execution had been postponed and rearranged on several occasions, a frequently disregarded method of psychological torment. The uncertainty regarding the exact timing of death was purposefully employed against prisoners. Upon being told that the time had come, Anne was guided from her chambers along hallways these were once walked through as queen to be 3 years prior. Instead of guards escorting her out of respect, they now accompanied to prevent escape, while courtiers who once bowed before her now observed her final steps with calculated disinterest. The scaffold set up on Tower Green stood unusually low, only 3 feet off the ground, in contrast to the towering platforms commonly portrayed in movies. This strategic choice meant Anne had to climb mere steps, denying her the dignity of elevation and bringing her closer to the taunting crowd. Historical records indicate a lively carnival-like atmosphere was intentionally fostered, rather than the solemn, respectful gatherings often depicted today. The execution served as a public spectacle, serving as a warning to those who defied the king's power, especially women daring to rise above their right. Prior to kneeling at the block, Anne was granted one last speech not due to mercy, but because tradition required it. Her words strategically chosen highlighted her political shrewdness and desperate situation. "Good people, I have come here to die, for according to the law I am condemned to die, and so I will say nothing against it." This seeming acceptance of her fate was in fact her final act of defiance. By acknowledging the law without confessing guilt, she subtly questioned the validity of the charges brought against her. Most disconcerting perhaps was the king's absence. Unlike typical portrayals of royal executions, Henry VIII did not attend. Instead, he stayed at Whitehall Palace awaiting confirmation of Anne's death. While a sword took her life, Henry allegedly rejoiced over his impending marriage to Jane Seymour, symbolizing how utterly cast aside Anne had become. Personal matters turned political, and Anne's demise served as an unfortunate yet necessary step in the king's quest for a male heir. The Calais hired swordsman, paid generously for his skills, added another layer of calculated brutality. English beheadings usually necessitated multiple axe blows, but this Frenchman was adept at executing decapitation with a single stroke. An unfamiliar figure too, and in her final moments, she would meet death at the hands of a stranger, enduring one last insult as a queen who had once captivated all England. Blindfolding, traditionally portrayed as a merciful act to spare her the sight of the executioner's sword, served a more practical function, preventing last-minute movements that could disrupt the execution process. In contrast to popular belief, Anne Boleyn knelt upright instead of placing her head on a block, a traditional French practice that increased the executioner's difficulty. This position required Anne to maintain her stillness through sheer determination, even as the swordsman prepared his strike. Witnesses stated that she moved her lips in prayer, her eyes darting beneath the blindfold in an attempt to hear the approaching blade. The psychological distress of not knowing when death would strike can be considered a form of unacknowledged torture. In many sanitized historical accounts, the actual beheading was remarkably clean by Tudor standards, with a single stroke severing Anne's head. However, the aftermath of her execution is usually left out of polite historical narratives. Witnesses claim her eyes and mouth continued to twitch for several seconds following decapitation, a shocking bodily reaction that happens when brain tissue retains oxygen. Some even report her lips forming words, potentially completing a prayer abruptly ended by the sword strike. This unsettling scene caused several witnesses to faint, while others turned away in disgust at this bleak symbol of the fragile bond between body and spirit. Possibly most tellingly, no fitting coffin was arranged for Anne's remains. Her court ladies, overwhelmed with grief and shock, had to hastily locate a chest to store her head and body. This seemingly insignificant oversight underscores the utter disregard for Anne's dignity. Even in death, she was an afterthought, a political issue resolved rather than a person deserving of fundamental funeral rites. Anne was hastily interred in an unadorned grave within the Tower Chapel, skipping a proper Christian funeral. The king seemingly wanted her memory to vanish as swiftly as her life did. The crown's resolve to erase and extended beyond death. Court painters were ordered to destroy her portraits, her royal symbols were chiseled from palace walls, and courtiers soon learned that uttering her name could invite royal disfavor. While we usually focus on the actual act of execution, this widespread removal of Anne's existence remains a form of post-mortem violence, an attempt to extinguish not just a person but a legacy. Historians would not start piecing together Anne's life from the remnants left by Henry's purge for centuries. Anne's execution also left deep scars on those who had to witness it, particularly her attendants who were tasked with cleaning and preparing her decapitated head before burial. These women, fearful of being associated with the Queen's alleged wrongdoings, were forced to carry out this gruesome duty while maintaining their composure. Many reportedly endured nightmares for years afterwards, and at least one eventually joined a convent, unable to carry on with court life following the events she had witnessed. The impact of psychological trauma was felt far and wide, casting a shadow of fear over Henry's court throughout the remainder of his rule. Immediately after the execution, Anne's daughter Elizabeth, who was not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. This child, who would later become England's most renowned queen, was effectively abandoned, her mother executed, and her father publicly rejecting her legitimacy. Court documents reveal that Elizabeth suddenly found herself without suitable clothing or fitting attendants, her household dismantled swiftly. The inhumane treatment meted out to the child, coupled with Anne's execution, underscores another aspect of the grotesquerie surrounding her death. Her innocent offspring bore the brunt of this punishment. Modern portrayals of Tudor executions seldom convey the intense sensory impact. The scaffold would have been steeped in the blood from prior executions, and teeming with flies in the May heat. The crowd's uproar, orchestrated by supporters planted to cheer the Queen's demise, formed a wall of noise meant to disorient and frighten. As Anne neared Tower Green, she would have heard this din growing louder, accompanied by jeers and taunts from a public whipped into viewing her as a sorceress and adulteress. This calculated public humiliation was integral to Tudor justice. Death was not considered sufficient punishment, it needed more. Pop culture frequently portrays Anne's last speech as a moment of noble defiance, but historical records suggest a more complex truth. Anne Boleyn's carefully constructed address extolling the king as a benevolent monarch mirrored her challenging circumstances. Under threat of death, she could not express herself freely. Her speech was limited by worries for her daughter's future and the scrutiny of the crowd. Her words did not embody freedom of speech, but rather its antithesis, the ultimate suppression of a woman who understood that even her final utterances would reach the king and affect those she left behind. The sword from France that took Anne's life symbolized the theatrical nature of her execution. Henry went to great lengths to stage an appropriate spectacle for a queen's fall. The executioner, it is said, had previously practiced on animals to achieve the single precise stroke that would secure his generous payment. This calculated professionalism, turning Anne's death into a technical hurdle, encapsulates the depersonalization inherent in state-sanctioned executions. Anne was not merely executed, her death was orchestrated by a system aimed at converting human agony into political propaganda. Modern records indicate that no English executioner was willing to carry out the act, not due to moral scruples, but because the French sword technique demanded specific training. The blade was finely honed and balanced differently than an English axe, crafted for a swift horizontal strike rather than the downward blow of an axe. This technical aspect highlights the dramatic essence of Anne's execution. Even her mode of death was strategically chosen for maximum effect and minimal mess, ensuring the spectacle would unfold without the unsavory complications of a botched beheading. Post the sword's descent, Thomas Wyatt himself, detained in the Tower and compelled to observe the execution of a woman he once revered. Penned about the little throat that had been adorned with countless jewels, his poetic elegy encapsulates the gruesome metamorphosis of and from a radiant queen to an objectified corpse. Her head, wrapping in linen by her sobbing attendants, was shown to the crowd by the executioner, hoisting aloft by the hair, a customary gesture signifying the fulfilled sentence. This public exhibition, with blood still gushing from the severed arteries, left an indelible visual impression on the spectators. The records of the Tower suggest that Anne's remains were interred hastily, abridging Christian burial rites to near insignificance. Her chest, filled with arrow-pierced head and body, was placed beneath the chapel floor along with other executed nobles, marking a disgraceful end for a crowned Queen of England. Anne Boleyn's burial site remained undetermined for hundreds of years due to a lack of marker, symbolizing the pinnacle of Henry's effort to erase her not only from existence, but also from historical records. This endeavor aimed at and came distressingly close to success. In the aftermath of her execution, Henry's propagandists hurriedly manipulated public perception. Poets who had once celebrated Anne's intelligence and beauty now wrote verses labeling her as a cunning adulteress. Official records accentuated the king's mercy in granting a skilled swordsman instead of traditional methods, reinterpreting Henry's dramatic decision as thoughtful compassion. The horrific reality of the execution was systematically cleansed from official documents, initiating the lengthy process of historical revision that still impacts our comprehension of Anne's final moments. Rapidly resuming normal life appears troubling in contemporary perspective, For Henry VIII, as he formally engaged with Jane Seymour the day following Anne's execution and married his third wife within mere 2 weeks after sending his second to the scaffold in a hushed ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This swift pace suggests that Anne's execution served as a convenient remedy to political issues. Failing to produce a male heir, she was discarded and replaced without regard for her personal suffering or death as a tragedy. Instead, the focus shifted towards statecraft and dynasty development. The psychological impact of Anne's execution extended beyond the scaffold, as she endured relentless interrogation, sleep deprivation, and isolation from supporters in the weeks prior to her death. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister who orchestrated the accusations against Anne, employed methods strikingly alike modern psychological torment, and faced self-isolation, sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation, and misinformation deployment prior to her execution. By the time she reached the scaffold, her mental resistance had been systematically weakened to prevent any formidable final protest. Historical records detail unprecedented security measures enforced for Anne's execution, even surpassing those typically applied to high-ranking traitors. The garrison at the tower was doubled, and additional guards were stationed throughout the fortress compound. These precautions served not to prevent escape, but to bar any sympathizers from staging a last-minute intervention or stirring public opposition against the execution. The extravagant display of force also aimed to instill fear into anyone harboring sympathy for and compelling them into silent submission to the king's decree. Furthermore, scheduling the execution during mid-morning rather than at dawn maximized attendance from London citizens. Tower Green could host a select gathering of nobility and officials, but its lofty stature allowed outsiders to catch wind of the completion announcement. Church bells across London then chimed at the instant of death, echoing a city-wide recognition of royal authority. This arrangement turned Anne's personal agony into a public spectacle, her demise acting as political drama instead of private tragedy. A frequently disregarded aspect of Anne's execution involves the outcome of her fellow defendants. 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, were beheaded mere days prior to and indicted for adultery with the Queen. Their executions served to solidify the evidence of Anne's supposed crimes before hers, eliminating any chance that their final words might conflict with the official storyline. One of Tudor England's most audacious acts of state-sponsored violence, the judicially orchestrated execution of 6 individuals convicted on largely fabricated evidence, mirrors the brutality of Stalin's show trials in a later era. Despite a memorial at Tower Green marking the approximate location of Anne's execution, historical records suggest the scaffold was positioned elsewhere within the Tower compound. This geographical inconsistency symbolizes how Anne's demise has been repeatedly reinterpreted and resituated both spatially and historically to accommodate diverse narratives. The sanitized, romanticized portrayal of her execution prevalent in popular culture bears little likeness to the psychological manipulation, character defamation, and deliberate cruelty that marked her final days in May 1536. Anne Boleyn's execution is horrifying not only for the physical beheading, but also because it symbolizes a complete effort to erase a woman who rose too prominently for Tudor society. She was not just executed, her reputation was destroyed, her accomplishments reduced, and her existence almost wiped out from history. Upon close examination of her final days, the mental torture, public humiliation, dramatic staging, and attempts to erase her memory expose a more disturbing horror than the swift cut of a French sword. From a modern psychological viewpoint, Anne's execution represents a case study in government-approved gaslighting and public character attack. The accusations against her, including adultery with numerous men like her brother and plotting to poison the king, were so ridiculous they would never be accepted in any modern trial. Through clever shaping of public opinion, careful use of torture for confessions from fellow suspects, and complete control over all official accounts, Henry's rule successfully convinced many people that Anne deserved her punishment. The most frightening part of her execution might be this intentional manipulation of truth itself. 500 years later, the execution of Anne Boleyn remains fascinating due to its mix of personal bad luck and planned politics. Her death was not just the end of a life, but a carefully organized event meant to make the king's actions look fair and change how history would see it. The real fear is not in the sword's fall, but in realizing how total power can change truth, a lesson that still feels dangerous in our modern time where information is controlled and people's image is attacked. The final sadness for Anne could be that even though Henry tried to remove her, it was her death, not her life, that became her main legacy. Looking deeply at the cruel reality of Anne Boleyn's execution forces us to face hard truths about power, women's roles, and how history is told. The cleaned-up version of her death, a queen getting a fast and noble end, hides the abuse of government power that her story really shows. Studying the mental side of her execution, the planned tortures, public shame, damage to her name, and efforts to erase her gives us a look not just into Tudor law but into how rulers keep power by controlling both bodies and stories. In Anne's cut-off head we see a warning about how truth can be broken by unlimited power.